How We Won by Charlotte T. Zitlow, Chapter 9, The Enigma of Endorsements. In the 50s and 60s, the traditional political environment used endorsements as declarations of authority pronounced by the local newspapers and occasionally the radio stations. This was a time before social media and cable TV news outlets even existed. Newspapers were the primary organs of communication. Bloomington had 3 of them, and were the arbiters of news and information, assumed to be the words of knowledge and understanding. Perhaps published endorsements don't mean as much anymore, but people paid attention to them back then. In the Bloomington city election of 1971, endorsements flourished. The view of the established press was pretty clear from the skepticism underlying its coverage, but the campaign was well endorsed. It was not typical of the media to outline their basic principles. They were, to some extent, assumed. So the endorsements of the campaign of 1971 were predictable. What was interesting was to see how the newspapers would justify their choices. Endorsements came from 2 directions, the in and the out. Both felt they were using whatever pressure they could to exert for the good of the community. Their views of what was the good varied. This posed a dilemma for the Democratic slate. How could we be perceived as good, solid citizens, just like the Republicans felt they themselves to be, and yet launch our modest revolution? We accepted the reality that most of us would not receive any establishment endorsements and tried not to mind, though we, of course, believed we would do a better job if elected. The Herald Telephone was the biggest player in the endorsement game. From the start, they spent a great deal of time preparing for what they believed was inevitable. In doing so, however, they provided basic information about all the candidates, and that was a gift to us. Their conclusions did not surprise. Mayor Hooker had his detractors, as seen in the primary election, but he also had very strong supporters. A group of Democratic Students for Hooker came out in support. This was a strong acknowledgement of the restraint shown by the local authorities, the Bloomington Police, and the Monroe County Sheriff, as well as the IU Police, in their dealings with the student unrest here, with the exception of 2 entirely unrelated incidents, the burning of the black market and the fire in the old IU library. There was no significant violence. Civility generally prevailed despite an atmosphere of tension, suspicion, distrust, and anger. Endorsement from the Herald Telephone. The paper was adamant that Hooker should be retained. It wrote, "He has more experience by far. He has an 8-year record of accomplishments. His up-to-date management systems have made the tax rates for his financial and operational programs the 2nd lowest in the state for cities of this size. He has an unselfish and consuming devotion to the city. The HT feels he deserves a term when the demands on the city of the student unrest and other issues won't distract him from his work." Endorsement from the Courier-Tribune. The Courier-Tribune, the Sarkis-Tarzian newspaper, with the conservative editorial policy but very down-to-earth reporters, promoted the Hooker team. The editors of the CT had a sincere and genuine concern for Bloomington and felt compelled to make their interests known. Their editorial elucidated their concerns. In short, idealism must be balanced with practicality. It is also true that change for the sake of change alone is unwise. Mayor Hooker has demonstrated dedication, knowledge, and vision for 8 years and leadership ability to implement them. His unnamed opponent is untried. Bloomington needs the kind of continuity, and Hooker will need support, so the entire Hooker team should be elected to support him in his endeavors. No candidate other than Hooker is mentioned by name. IDS endorses Hooker. The Indiana Daily Student was brief but clear in its endorsement. They wrote that Hooker had been a dedicated worker and had plans, not just programs, to move forward. They added that he had been a good mayor and hoped that in another term he would do better. He had the experience and skill, as well as the sincerity and idealism, which were also McCloskey's selling points. They urged students to vote for Hooker. Democratic Students for Hooker, who seemed to have some funding, took out a number of newspaper ads supporting Jack Hooker. If Hooker had been mayor of Kent, no one would have ever heard of Kent State. And another entitled, Ecology for hypocrisy. They noted that posters for McCloskey had been taped to trees. In a counterattack, the president of the student government, Mary Scripes, announced her endorsement of McCloskey and the entire Democratic ticket. She described the Democratic ticket as the most knowledgeable of anyone ever to seek office in the city of Bloomington. She described the Hooker administration as doing little to address the problems facing the community, planning and zoning, the need for mass transit, and for city-county cooperation and fire and police protection. In a sidebar tiff, the Democratic campaign chair, Dale Bruckner, and Jeff Grodner, chair of the Democratic Students for McCloskey, filed a complaint in the county court against the Democratic Students for Hooker, challenging their legitimacy. After the election, the case was dropped. The newspaper endorsers, with their barrels of ink, were countered with budget responses from two grassroots organizations. The Citizens for Good Government, CGG, professed to be nonpartisan. Indeed, they endorsed both Republicans and Democrats in the 1970 election, focusing primarily on the food stamp versus commodities issue. They employed a ranking system of preferred, strongly preferred, or not preferred. The Indiana Student Voters Union by 1971 just called themselves the Voters Union. In the 1970 election, had actively opposed the policy of the county clerk preventing students, especially unmarried women students, from registering to vote, and actively supported Reverend Butler for Bloomington Township trustee. For that election, they interviewed candidates, rated them accordingly to the scale they defined, and publicized the ranking. Then they printed the recommendation out on yellow legal sheets and distributed them throughout the community. They had almost total success and were ready to duplicate this effort in the 1971 fall election, as they had done in the primary. They did not claim to be bipartisan, but nonpartisan and issue-based. So the well-funded establishment media were lined up against the low-budget challengers. Who would be most persuasive? In the mayor's race, the endorsements which might have played a role were those of the grassroots. The CGG decision about the mayor's race made headlines in the Herald Telephone. It came as a surprise. CGG declines mayoral endorsement. In the flyer and ads which the CGG distributed, the statement in the mayor's race was simple. This organization chooses not to advise in the mayoral race. The explanation was that the research committee could not, after extensive and serious discussions, reach a consensus. They found both candidates with positive attributes and weaknesses and could not make a clear choice between them. The Voters Union, on the other hand, ranked candidates with a scale strongly recommended, and not recommended. The VU recommended Frank McCloskey. They found him open to ideas, knowledgeable, and appreciated his dedication to the issues of planning, zoning, ecology, mass transit, student housing programs, annexation, and his strong opposition to patronage. Hooker was a nice guy who was unable to keep up with the city's growth, who tended not to delegate, and who had a small, closed circle of advisors, not tapping the resources of the community offered for help. Endorsements of the city council candidates at large: Wayne Fix, Brian De St. Croix, Dick Behan, and versus Bud Ferris, Bob Clegg, Clyde Day, Republican incumbents. The Herald Telephone, CGG, and VU each evaluated the council candidates individually and delivered their decision shortly before the election. Democrat Wayne Fix, a self-described environmentalist, was the only at-large candidate whom the HT endorsed without reservation. The editor commended his conservative demeanor and ability to communicate across the board, as well as his knowledge of land use and property and his years of experience. Fix was also a preferred candidate of the CGG, which echoed the HT plaudits, and cited his work as a land surveyor and his work for IU real estate. The VU agreed with those assessments and added his interest in mass transit, student issues, housing, and planning to earn him their strongly recommended label. Bud Ferris and Bob Clegg were incumbents who had been involved in the community, were hardworking, and would bring knowledge and continuity to the council. But the HT regretted their lack of oversight on major issues. This observation overlapped to some extent with the CGG evaluation of two Republicans. Ferris and Clegg were both very loyal supporters of Mayor Hooker, without question. Clegg had an understanding of annexation issues and planning, and Ferris was an enthusiastic supporter of the definitive JJ&R report. The CGG did not prefer them. Clegg, to the members of the Voters' Union, is probably the most competent of the incumbents and was cited for his interest in student issues, but he was also a very loyal Hooker supporter, and his ability to come up with new ideas has not impacted the council or the mayor. Bud Ferris was one of the main problems on the council, part of Hooker's inner circle, and a strong opponent of the Voters' Union. The VU did not recommend either of them. Finally, the third incumbent council member, Clyde Day, had been on the council off and on for 6 years, but the HT did not feel this had given him the understanding of the city problems one might expect. His passive approach to council affairs will not inspire imaginative, creative solutions to the community problems. The CGG found that Day was comfortable going along with the mayor's ideas, although he may have endorsed his initial support for the high-rise. They did not prefer him. Brian de Croix was described by the HT as a young, vital, and articulate candidate with knowledge and presence beyond his years. They lauded his ability to communicate with low-income community because of his work with the Community Action Program, but felt his ability to talk with other segments of the community as untested. They did not endorse him. The CGG, on the other hand, determined that de Croix was not only able to talk to the low-income community, but was effective with all segments, that he favored mass transit, good planning, a strong council acting as a check on the mayor, housing code enforcements, and seeking federal funds. He put a premium on human needs. They strongly preferred him. The VU concurred emphatically with a strongly recommended designation. De Croix was young, dynamic, sharp, strong on ecology, housing, buses, planning, housing problems, articulate and mature, a future leader. The third Democrat, Richard Dick Behan, in the opinion of the HT, has only one shortcoming: lack of experience in government. They found him knowledgeable and backgrounded in city problems. They found him open-minded on key issues, mass transit, high-rise for the elderly. They endorsed him. The CGG included him, together with Fix and de Croix, as their preferred council-at-large choices. The VU was more measured, noting that Behan had worked hard to understand student and other viewpoints and would bring business understanding. He had shown himself willing to speak out, but probably needed to study some of the other issues. They recommended him, while they strongly recommended de Croix and Fix. Endorsements of district candidates. The first district, Rod Fawcett, Democrat, versus Jack Morrison, Republican incumbent. In their support of Jack Morrison, the HT found him knowledgeable. Note, when track down article, how much of this is actual quote. Dedicated, practical, down-to-earth, and not afraid to disagree with the administration. He was dedicated to the West Side, but knew the whole city, whereas James Fawcett was less knowledgeable about the city as a whole. The HT gave Fawcett credit for a keen understanding of the areas he knew, but believed Morrison would be a more productive member of the council. The CGG preferred Morrison for his strong work with the West Side Association, his willingness to work with others. He was open to some form of mass transit, had improved lighting on the West Side, strongly opposed the high-rise, and did not hesitate to say so. Fawcett failed to appear for interviews, skipped the Rap Line radio program and the interview with CGG, and did not furnish materials to explain his positions on them. CGG preferred Morrison. The VU found that Fawcett had little knowledge of the issues, while Morrison was an energetic spokesman for the West Side and the West Side Association. They found him with a narrow view of government, an anti-Hooker stance, and conservative bent. They posted not recommended for Fawcett, but did not recommend Morrison. The second district, David Stipp, Republican versus Alfred Toll, Democrat. David Stipp won the endorsement of the HT after a thoughtful analysis of the goals and methods of the two candidates. It stated that the two candidates were not that far apart in where they wanted the city to go, but quite different in how they would achieve their goals. They credited both candidates with knowledge, understanding, and a record of involvement, but when all was said and done, they endorsed Stipp. because they felt he had a more middle-of-the-road person in accordance with the newspaper's orientation. They worried that Towle would be too independent. The CGG described Towle's preparation and ideas for dealing with housing, ecological, and planning needs, open administration, better planned development at length, and rated him preferred. David Stipp was the assistant director of the IU Real Estate, a large property owner in the city, and found spot zoning unfortunate but inevitable. He also approved construction in the Jackson Creek floodplain. To no one's surprise, the VU strongly recommended Towle, one of its founders and past chair, for his interest in and concern about housing, planning, the environment, citizen participation, buses, student issues, and having at one point chaired the local NAACP. The 3rd District, Sherwin-Meisel, Democrat, versus Donald Nicholas, Republican. Sherwin-Meisel and his activities over the years earned him a clear endorsement from the HT, citing his leadership in organizing the Park Ridge Association and Contact, the citizen planning group. They felt he brought both knowledge and organizational ability to the council. His opponent, Dan Nichols, was also well-informed and had good ideas, but he did not bring the same experience and expertise to the table as Meisel. The CGG cited a litany of what Meisel sees as major issues, but fire protection, traffic planning, mass transit, land use planning, involvement in the citizens in government, effective controls on all sorts of pollution. He had done much towards solving these problems, and they preferred him to Nicholas. Nicholas was also well-informed, favored planning and ecological issues, but did not bring the experience Meisel had to the table. Meisel was preferred. The VU handled the dilemma of the two good candidates by strongly recommending Meisel and recommending Nicholas. Meisel was informed on all the issues and excelled in those of land use and planning, with a record of work to show for it. Nicholas was strong in ecological issues, favored buses, and went along with the master plan. The 4th District, Dr. Harry Day, Republican incumbent, versus Mrs. Charlotte Zitlow. According to the HT, there were two impressive candidates. They find that Day had served well, but he had a shortcoming. It would be that he studied an issue so thoroughly that decisions were delayed too long. Day was an associate dean, a professor of chemistry. Mrs. Zitlow, a housewife, her husband a member of the faculty in literature, but she was also, they felt, a good researcher, active in city affairs as a participant and as a citizen, resourceful, would bring thought-out ideas to solve problems, but is unrealistic in her thoughts about mass transit. Dr. Day gets the endorsement based on the edge of his experience and diversity of experience. The CGG described Mrs. Zitlow as an active, community-minded citizen. They found that she had made an effort to inform herself on many issues and to understand the needs of the community. She believed in a strong city council responsive to the community. Mr. Day had shown himself to be moderate but progressive member of the council, authoring the recent Environmental Commission and promoting fluoridation of the water. He usually votes with the majority. Zitlow was preferred. The VU characterized Day as a man of goodwill who gives service to many good causes, but never seems to do anything. They cited his position on buses, which he favored, but saw immutable impediments that meant nothing would happen. Zitlow was strongly recommended. The 5th District, Edris Baker, Republican versus Herbert Davis, Democrat. The HT started its review of the candidates by noting that neither of them had experience in politics or government. Herbert Davis got the edge for an endorsement because he'd done his homework better and had a more positive attitude toward solutions. They ascribed that to the fact that he was an engineer, although he was a Methodist minister. He was also a Methodist minister. Mrs. Baker was a lifelong resident of the area and thus had the advantage of knowing it better, but did not seem to have done her homework and was unprepared. Mrs. Baker seemed to lack the imagination which we feel a city council member should have. The CGG was very impressed with Herbert Davis. He was a trained engineer, though a minister, and very knowledgeable about many things. He demonstrated sincere concerns for human needs. He had a thoughtful approach to mass transit. Mrs. Baker, on the other hand, was a schoolteacher and an admirer of Mayor Hooker, looking forward to furthering his initiatives. CGG preferred Davis. The VU liked Davis's engineering skills too, which could be valuable in planning. He was a hard worker, progressive on issues, friendly to students. Baker was a Hooker fan who saw no need for buses and thought environmental programs would cost too much. Davis was recommended. The 6th District, James Ackerman, Democrat versus Richard Fee, Republican. HT. Dick Fee and Jim Ackerman were both well-versed in city government issues, one by the experience and the other by educating himself. Fee had an admirable record of independent thinking and more realistic approach to issues, especially on mass transit. Ackerman, the HT felt, may have been a bit naive in some of his solutions, and Fee got the endorsement for another 4 years of being a respected watchdog. CGG preferred Ackerman. Fee was a frequent critic of Mayor Hooker and opposed the high-rise, though he favored housing for the elderly. His main concern revolved around zoning. Ackerman, however, had given much thought to the issues in his initial concerns with the environment to housing, planning, zoning, and mass transit. His recommendations were unified, carefully thought out, and well expressed. To the VU, Fee's maverick performance on the council had provided competence as a watchdog on financial issues of the administration, but he also shown little imagination thinking on issues. He was intelligent but conservative. Ackerman, a professor in religion, was inexperienced in politics, but a brilliant, innovative thinker on issues, and he is very concerned about student rights. Ackerman was strongly recommended. In an editorial in the HT the day they started printing their endorsements, the editorial board wrote their reasons for doing endorsements at all. First, they had objected to the endorsements of the CGG and the VU in previous elections. Risking being called hypocritical, they felt they needed to present a different kind of endorsement, more informative and not intended to influence the voter. Indeed, both the CGG and the VU did not disguise that they were organized to influence the voter. The HT tried to distance itself from that motive. It claimed the endorsements were for educational purposes only. And in July, well before the general election, the HT reporter Jeff Smithburn wrote a feature article, Political Endorsements. What are their roles? It addressed the concerns of some candidates in the primary that had CGG and the VU somehow violated some undefined law by expressing their opinions about candidates. Tom Lemon, the losing candidate in the spring Democratic primary for mayor, went so far as to file a suit with the prosecutor, but the prosecutor, Tom Barry, found no merit in the case. CGG especially was attacked because it professed to be neutral but clearly had opinions. It also claimed to be nonpartisan, not necessarily for either party. The VU was more clear-spoken in its position, unabashedly progressive, liberal, and favoring those who had the issues of the students at heart. Yet it called itself bipartisan. What is one to make of that? Simply that it does not make sense that the HT would respond with its own endorsements based on an extensive interviews and occasional referring to its own philosophy. It's also clear that when the election was drawing to a conclusion, the HT avoided saying anything about those it did not endorse that might have burnt any bridges. Perhaps they were foreseeing the outcome. Perhaps they were just being unbiased press. Their occasional comments along the way. The student with a dark bushy beard who was so controversial and the housewife hardly demonstrated any reluctance to influence the readers. It remains a mystery to this day why I was called a mere housewife and Mrs. Baker was not. One can draw one's own conclusion. Despite the extensive exposure the candidates had to the public, coffees, door-to-door canvassing, public events, the majority of voters, no doubt, never met the candidates directly. In normal elections, interest seldom focuses on the campaign until shortly before the election. For so many, the endorsements might have been the first cooperatively in-depth view of the individuals who were about to run the city. In this sense, endorsement played a definitive role. Whether these endorsements affected the outcome of the election, no one can guess. The results were so clearly along the lines of the CGG and the VU recommendations or preferences that one might conclude that the voters found these groups echoing their own inclinations. In an election with so much at stake, basically the possibility of a regime change overnight, the more information voters had, the better. And if it was in the context of one endorser or another, and the endorser's opinions were clear and understood, the voters' choices and the endorsements were likely to be aligned. The endorsements were better than we expected. Maybe we could win.